Let's talk for a little bit about the kind of evolution of cannabis science. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here as it's not my field of expertise. But let's kind of like we did with chemistry, start with a basic definition. So cannabis is a genus of plant. That includes psychoactive chemicals that are used in medicine, also in drug use and drug production. So the classification that we're going to, or sorry, the class that we're going to focus on are cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, and cannabis brutalis. And we're really going to be looking at the cannabinoids and the terpene compounds that are actually found in these cannabis plants. There's a couple of histories of cannabis and cannabis science if you're interested in them. So if you go to Arrowhead, I have a link here that takes you to a nice timeline of cannabis, and it shows its use going back into the far reaches of history. And a lot of it is more of the use of the plant over time with humans. I have a couple of linked articles that are long, but if you want to, if this is super interesting, dive into these. They're interesting. One about the early history of cannabinoid research, and it's a kind of an overview and a short history. Another one about the history, or at least the first 60 years of real cannabinoid pharmacology research. And so I've got links to these here in the at least the Canvas shell. And kind of just like in general, to speak to this a bit, I'll just say that in terms of the chemistry side of cannabis research, because there's growing like all the work that was done on like how to grow plants, and there's all this plant biology to look into, but just looking at it from the chemistry perspective, the first extraction that we saw was in like 1847, which is quite a while ago. I was actually surprised by that. And then there wasn't too much research until we saw the Marijuana Tax Act, and that essentially made the plant illegal. And in that time, a couple years afterwards, fantastic organic chemist was asked to try to identify what the intoxicating properties within the plant were. And so that kind of sparked research into extracting and identifying and isolating the different compounds that were in cannabis plants. And so like around 1939, 1940, you see the isolation of CBD. And then that's then followed by CBN. THC is further down the road. Research then is kind of in this like identification phase of extracting, but especially when marijuana becomes illegal, it's hard to be able to do mainstream research on the plant or the compounds within it, because any scheduled drug is going to have a whole lot more barriers to being able to perform research, or it will have to be done in a government lab. And so it basically kind of halts research through these kind of mainstream channels. The kind of thrust of it, though, goes into identifying the different compounds within further, but then also synthesizing the compounds through different pathways rather than isolating them from a plant, taking some other compound and going through a bunch of different steps in a chemistry lab, and then ending up with THC or CBD. And then the research that sparks from that as well is looking at analogs and like, okay, well, here's the structure of THC, but what if like it's a little bit different? What if there's a few extra atoms here and there, like we bond to this different group, and seeing the effect of that. And then research also goes into the biochemistry of the different compounds that were contained in cannabis. And that is like a huge field of research and understanding like how our body's actually interacting with it. And then it keeps going. There's so much out there. and I could spend some time talking about it. And I myself probably have quite a bit more reading to do about it. Um, but what I think is interesting is that we saw uh, research on cannabis in mainstream science as kind of being incited by trying to identify, to track, to make illegal, and a lot of work to innovate in growing the plants or in extracts or in the medicinal properties of cannabis, while it was illegal, had to take place outside of that mainstream scientific community. And so that's why I kind of want to take a second here to talk about like, what is science? What's scientific? And was that work that was being done that advanced the cannabis industry during its prohibition, is that science? Which I think is an interesting topic. So what I have here is this science checklist, because it turns out it's actually pretty difficult to precisely define what is scientific. The problem is that it's just a really broad idea of doing science. And it looks really different depending on different fields. And it can be anything from like something like concrete, like a laser, and the development of that, to something a little bit less like you can't hold it, that's like thinking about like human decision making. And so there's this checklist that was developed by a great group that's looking at like uh, science communication research, and has these kind of points to kind of go through to say like, is something or an endeavor scientific, or how scientific is it? And so some of the things that really stand out to me, so it's like focuses on the natural world, check for cannabis, right? Like it's a natural plant, aims to explain the natural world. And so a lot of the work that was done to advance cannabis science in the black market, or at least outside of mainstream labs, definitely was trying to explain and understand like how these plants could be made like more potent for their medicinal qualities, or how to extract things out in different ways. Uses testable ideas, relies on evidence, involves the scientific community. That's the one I think that's interesting. Leads to ongoing research and benefits from scientific behavior. So the one that stands out the most is the involves the scientific community. And typically we think of this as, you involve the scientific community by publishing your research with a journal where it can be peer reviewed by other scientists in your field. And then it's available for everyone to be able to read and give feedback on and try to reproduce your results. And that process of peer review is something that takes place in a legal framework for lab science. And so even though the cannabis industry has benefited from people innovating, it was all done without that typical peer review process. And there most likely was peer review taking place in just collaboration, but in a fragmented way, and not one that has a record, like we have with other fields that weren't subject to being made illegal. And so an interesting question is like, is that still science if we kind of eliminate the ability to have that open discourse and peer review process? I think so, but this is an open-ended question. I'll just leave it at that. Like, let me know what you think. So here's my example that I have for this. And you could kind of go through the checklist, but so one example is the invention of the first invention to mechanically, rather than having an individual do it, separate trichomes from plant material, cannabis. And so this was Mila Jensen, and you can actually, she just published a book called How I Became the Hash Queen, that I've read excerpts of only. But she invented the pollinator in 1994. And so what she did was she made a machine that essentially is like a washing machine, but you put in cannabis plant clippings and it agitates it, and you get all of the trichomes, the little bits of the oily good stuff on the plant material to come. They separate from the plant and they fall through a screen and can then be collected and pressed into hash. And so it's a way of using more of the plant for people that are growing on a large scale. And you can see we have, here is the pollinator. It's what her first invention was. And she's had several things, is right here. And it produces a hash that looks like this when it's pressed. This is the High Times article from 1996 about her innovation. And it's interesting because she did, like, she completely innovated in a field where this was something that you would have to like manipulate by hand, and like created a machine that could do it for people who were processing large quantities of plants. And it like was then another way to generate income through essentially taking the plant material you were going to throw away and extracting out essentially hash and selling that, which is super cool. But is this science, right? Like, she did this outside of the peer review process, outside of the scientific community, and it did benefit an entire industry, and people innovated off of it. And she innovated off of it by coming out with different types of machines and coming out with an ice water hash process, and a machine to help make bubble hash as well. And so looking at something like this, I actually think that what Mila did is actually like classic engineering. And whether or not engineering and science are the same thing is kind of a conversation for a different day. But it's like classic innovation and engineering, and it's happening completely outside the scientific community. But it's still science, in my opinion, or it's still engineering. So this was, I think, a perfect example of kind of like innovation outside of the typical process.